What breaks your heart? Because if you're wondering, okay, what needs to be done around me? What can I start doing to change the world around me? The best place to start is to start answering that question. What breaks my heart? What's the burden that's in my heart? The things that they'll pop up in the news every now and then, and they just kind of pull in your heartstrings. Maybe it's that trend in culture or in your community or your state or your nation or even just some part of the world. That thing that's going on that just kind of pulls on your heart, and it's not just a piece of news to you, you know? It's grabbing you and it's involving you. And maybe you look it up online and you're reading a little more about it and you read the article again and you're wondering, hey, why does this bother me so much? Why does it get to me so much? But your heart just kind of goes there. And see, when that kind of thing starts to happen, it becomes really easy to answer the question, what breaks my heart? Because there it is. It's happening. But we talked about this last week. The problem with that question, the problem with the question, what breaks my heart, is it's a very dangerous question. Because once you answer it, once you decide to actually do something about the things that break your heart, it's going to cost you something. Pastor Rick, my dad talked about this last week. It's going to cost you something. Something's going to be required of you. Maybe some time or some money, maybe some missed opportunities. And there's always going to be this tension between the things that break your heart and what it's going to cost you to do anything about it. There's always this tension between the things that we know we need to do and then what's going to be required of us to actually act on the things that we know we need to do. And we don't like that. And we said last week that it seems like by nature, we're life preservers, okay? We like to preserve our lives the way they are. We don't like major change, and we don't like sacrifice. We really don't like sacrifice. We have our lives, we have the way we like to live them, and we don't want to give that up. We want to kind of maintain the way it is and continue living the way we like. But of course, Jesus comes along and he says, whoever devotes themselves to themselves will have nothing but themselves to show for themselves. And for me, that's a scary thought. For me, it's a disturbing thought. The thought that at the end of my life, I've maintained the perfect weight and the perfect schedule, and I've never been in debt, and I've hit all of my goals for bettering me, but I've left absolutely no legacy behind in the lives of the people around me because I was devoted to me and bettering me, but never did anything for anybody other than myself, and I leveraged my life for nobody but me. And Jesus says that's a total loss. It's a total loss. But on the flip side of that, Jesus says, if you devote yourself to something that is more than yourself, then of course you're going to have something more than yourself to show for yourself. So, there's the recap, okay? There's the recap of the last 2 weeks, and now we're going into new ground here. Because up to this point, everything we've said pretty much applies to pretty well everyone, okay? Whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian or a churchgoer or not churchgoer, religious or not, whatever it is, that question, what breaks your heart, it's really applicable, okay? It's almost universally applicable. What tugs on my heartstrings? What gets me going? But if you're a Christian, there's a part of this idea that's really, really important for you and for me to understand, okay? It's really important for us to understand this particular idea, and so this morning I'm going to pick on us a little bit. I'm going to pick on the Christians. If you're not a Christian, you just kind of get to sit back and watch the fun happen, because I'm going to pick at us a little bit here. Because we as Christians, if we are not careful, okay? As Christians, if we are not careful, we can have a tendency to substitute devotion for action. You catch that? As Christians, if we're not careful, we have a tendency to substitute devotion for action. In other words, if we're not careful, we can be satisfied with believing a thing and believing all the right things, but not acting on those things. We say, yes, I believe in Jesus. I believe he's the Son of God, and I believe he came to die for our sins, and I believe in the New Testament, and I believe that, and I believe this, I believe all the stuff I was taught to believe. So me and God are good. Me and God are good because I believe the right stuff. And so, everything's all hunky-dory. And that was me for years, okay? I had the right beliefs, and I was good. I was set with God. God and I were on the right page because I believed the right stuff. And one day I opened up the New Testament, and I actually read the things that Jesus did and read the things that the people who followed him did and said, hey, wait a minute, am I following Jesus? If that's what his followers look like, I'm not doing those kinds of things. And as I begin to suddenly discover, as hopefully we're going to discover today, that belief alone is not enough. Belief alone is not enough. And now I should give you this disclaimer here before we go any further. This is not a message about how to become a Christian or about how to stay a Christian, okay? I'm not presenting to you a theology of salvation, just to get that out of the way for those of you theology heads. This is about what it would look like if we decided that instead of being simply categorically Christian, if we were to pick up and actually follow Jesus Christ, to actually follow him into the kind of things that he did and the things that he taught. Because when you decide to follow Jesus Christ, personal devotion is not enough, and personal belief is not enough either. So here we go. And then this is something as a side note here. We have a lot of names for ourselves as Christians, okay? We have a lot of things we call each other, identify each other with. And one of the really big ones for a long time has been believers, right? We are believers. We're fellow believers, believers in Christ, right? But what's unfortunate is I think as believers, there has been a tendency to become content with believing something instead of doing something. And so imagine for a second, what if we stopped calling ourselves believers for a minute and started calling ourselves doers? Because that's what James taught. It's exactly what James taught, and that's what Jesus taught too. How many of you, this statement right here that Jesus threw out here, how many of you find this familiar? Those of you who hear my words and do not do them are like a foolish man who built his house upon the sand. Recognize that? You hear my words, you don't do them, you are a fool who builds his house upon a foundation that will collapse as soon as a storm comes along. That was Jesus, okay? And unfortunately, as believers, sometimes we've become really content with making points rather than making a difference. And we're really, really, really good at making points. We're really, really, really good at finding all the things wrong with the world and wrong with culture and wrong with the people around us and wagging our finger at them. No, you shouldn't be doing that. No, you shouldn't be doing that. We're really good at finding what's wrong with the world and shaking our finger at it. You just look at any kind of social media for a second, and it's flooded with Christians making points. Good points, but they're just making points. Point after point after point after point. And if we look at it, as we're going to look at this morning, if all you're doing is making points, not that making a point is a bad thing. Jesus made a lot of points. But if all you're doing is making points and stopping there and not making a difference, we're not following Jesus Christ, because that's not what he did. So to open this whole idea up a little bit, I want to take us into one of the most familiar passages in the entire New Testament. For those of you who have been to more than one wedding, you've probably heard some verses from this chapter read, maybe even at your wedding, okay? I'm talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 13. This is the love chapter. Everybody recognizes the love chapter. Love is patient, love is kind, love is yada, 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 yada. We all recognize that. But we always focus on this one little section in that love chapter that's about 5 verses in, and we like to skip the part at the very beginning because it's uncomfortable. It's a little bit more disturbing, and you really don't read that part at weddings. You like to focus on the love is happy, love is sweet, and yada, 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 okay? We're going to focus on those first few verses this morning, and this letter, 1 Corinthians, or this chapter, chapter 13, is part of a letter that was written to a church, this church called the Church in Corinth, and the letter was written by the Apostle Paul, who was the guy who actually founded the church in Corinth. And Paul, for those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar with him, he founded that church in Corinth because Paul had this faith in Jesus Christ, okay? He had this belief, and he decided that it was not enough for him to just have a belief, but that he had to act on it. He had to shape his life around it. So Paul traveled all over the place. He traveled hundreds and thousands of miles all over the world, all over the known world, to spread the word of this guy named Jesus Christ. And so at one point he spread the word of Christ in a place that was far, far, far away from Paul's own home, this place called Corinth. And the people who responded to that message, they gathered together and they formed a church. And then sometime later, Paul wrote them a letter explaining to them and hoping to help them learn some of the really important things about following Jesus Christ. And we call that letter 1 Corinthians. He wrote another letter later on called 2 Corinthians, and probably one in between that's lost today. But we call that letter 1 Corinthians, okay? And particularly in the 13th chapter, Paul wrote some very, very important things for Christians, and some very, very disturbing things for those who call themselves followers of Jesus Christ. So I am going to read those things to you this morning. Now, first, in 1 Corinthians 13, up to this point in the letter, to give you a bit of context about what he's been talking about. Up to this point in the letter, Paul has been talking about the concept of giftedness. You know, giftedness as in things that God has blessed you with, or personality traits, or strengths, the areas that you're good at or strong in, as opposed to other areas where you might be weak in, okay? And so Paul has been addressing this idea of giftedness and addressing specifically this idea that God is impressed with devotion that doesn't have action attached to it. That God is impressed with all the stuff that we know in our heads versus the stuff that we actually do, okay? And so what Paul is going to communicate in these next few verses is this. You have to put action with your devotion. You have to put action in your devotion. Or if you want an easy way to remember this, put some motion with your devotion, okay? This is what Paul is trying to communicate. How's that for a pithy statement for you? Paul is going to say, look, guys, it's not enough to believe. It's not enough to be right. You have to do something with what you know, otherwise, ... And it's what he's going to say on the other side of that otherwise that's going to be so disturbing for us to hear this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. Here's what he says. We'll have this up on the screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 1, if you want to follow along. He says, if I. Now, he says if I, but he's really talking about you and me, okay? But he wants to kind of soft sell this. He kind of soften the blow of what he's about to say. So he says, if I. He says, if I speak in the tongues or languages of men and angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. So here's what he's saying here. He's saying, look, let's imagine that I have this wonderful spiritual gift, this incredible spiritual gift where I can speak in all these different languages of the world without having ever studied them. And I can do this in all these different languages because I have this incredible spiritual gift and people can just understand me. Because he's just been talking about giftedness in this letter, in chapter 12, okay? He's just been talking about giftedness. He says, let's say I have this incredible gift and I can speak in all these different languages and never having studied them before. And then he goes further, and let's say not only these languages of men, but let's say I can actually speak in the language of the angels. I can speak in the language of all these different people, all these people groups all over the world, and I can speak in the language of angels because God has given me this incredible gift. And we go, wait a minute, Paul, are you telling me there's a special angel for language for angels here? And now we're really interested because we want to go study that. And he goes, you know what, I have no idea, okay? I'm making an illustration. He's making a point, okay? And here's his point. He says, let's imagine I have this kind of gift. Let's imagine that I am so connected with God that God gave me this incredible ability to speak in all these different languages, to speak in the language of the angels. And I can do all this stuff, but did not have love. And the word love there in the Greek is a word you might recognize. It's the Greek word agape, okay? And agape is a special kind of love. It's action-oriented love. It's the others-oriented love. It's the doing love. So Paul is saying here, if I have this extraordinary connection with God, and I'm so connected with God, and I can speak in all these different languages, and the language of the angels, I have this incredible gift, and I'm praying in all these different languages, and people are looking at me and they're going, wow, listen to that guy pray in those languages. Wow, he's amazing. He's so connected with God. If I had that kind of connection with God, that kind of gift, that kind of intimate, awe-inspiring prayer life, awe-inspiring ability, but I didn't agape love the people around me, All that gift amounts to is nothing more than a resounding gong and a clanging cymbal. That's like, it's annoying, okay? It's annoying noise that does nobody any good. That's what he's saying. And we go, wait a minute, Paul, time out. How can you say that? That's a really cool gift. That's like a super spiritual thing. You know, the people who can do that, they're the ones who are closest to God, okay? And Paul says, if there's no action, if there's no love for others, then it's all about me, isn't it? If I have this kind of crazy gift, but have not agape love for the people around me, it's worthless. Then he goes on. And we say, wait, before you go on, Paul, wait. Are you discounting the importance of personal devotion and personal intimacy with God? And he says, no, I'm not discounting it. What I'm discounting is stopping there. What I'm discounting is going to that point and going no further at all. What I'm discounting is trying to measure your devotion with God by you and God alone and not your relation with other people as well. Because hear me here. Paul is telling us that if you stop your devotion to God with your personal prayer life, with your special spiritual gifts and abilities to pray in the tongues of men and angels, and with this incredible, awe-inspiring prayer life that wows the people around you, if it stops there, from God's perspective, it's just noise. It's just noise that's no good to anybody. So he goes on, and here he's going to get to people like me. He says that if I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom mysteries and all knowledge. In other words, he's saying, look, and even if you're one of those Christians that's got it all figured out, there's a verse for that. Or there's a verse for that. You know what? I've got a verse for that right here. You know, I've got 3 verses for that situation. One of those types, okay? The types that study, and you've got it all figured out. Somebody, throws out a chapter, like, John 11, you're like, Lazarus, you've got it all figured out. You know the whole thing, okay? You know your stuff. You studied all the different theological viewpoints, and you give me a discourse on all the different theological terms, and you can tell me about the all-important differences between infralapsarianism versus supralapsarianism. And you've studied the great theological fathers throughout the ages. You studied Ignatius and Clement and Origen and Irenaeus and Calvin and Luther and Zwingli and Edwards and Wesley and Barth and all these guys. You've got them all studied, and you know your stuff, okay? And you don't even just study the Bible. You study like the maps of the Bible. And you've got your Hebrew and your Greek and your Latin. And you study the angels versus the seraphim and the prophecies in Daniel versus the prophecies in Revelation. And you've got all this stuff figured out. Or maybe it's not that intense. Maybe you've got your beliefs and you know you're right. You got the right morals, you got the right beliefs, and I've got it figured out. I've got that much figured out at least. And Paul's saying, look, even if you are so educated, you're so knowledgeable that you can fathom all these mysteries, all this knowledge. And we say, wait, don't go any further. You're not going to tell us that that's not important, are you? This is coming from Paul. Paul was one of the most highly educated men in the New Testament. You can't tell us that that's not important. And he says, no, I'm not saying it's not important. What I'm saying is that if you stop with that, it's still all about you, isn't it? If you quit there, it's still all about me. And he says, and if I have faith that can move mountains. This is that person or that leader or even the pastor that is so sure that they are sure. They're so sure that they're sure. They're so sure that God has given them the right direction, that they're right, and they can pitch their voice in such a way that it sounds like it's coming from the mouth of God. Those guys, okay? And you're listening to them, and you're like, amen, woohoo, and they're so confident. And you're listening to them, and you're saying, surely they must be right. They're so confident. And God says, even if you are that kind of person with that mighty faith, but do not have love. We're saying, wait a minute. You're telling us that faith isn't important now? Paul, you're going too far. And he says, no, I'm not saying that's not important. I'm saying that is incomplete. I'm saying that is not the full circle. That is not the end of the road right there. He says, you may be the most mystically minded, God-experiencing person out there. You may be like the most Bible knowledgeable person in the world. You may have this awe-inspiring prayer life and speaking in the tongues of men and angels and all these incredible spiritual gifts. You may be this person with this massive faith and you're leading people, you're standing up and you're calling them to action because your faith in God is massive. And Paul says, even if you are that kind of guy, that kind of woman, but that does not express itself in unconditional, others-oriented, servant-hearted love. Here's the offensive part. You are, but he's not saying you are. He's trying to soft sell this. He says, I am nothing. I'm nothing. The Greek word there, just so we're clear, is uthen, and it means nothing. No good, worthless, nothing at all, okay? Nothing. You're uthen. Meaningless. You may be the Bible answer guy. The Bible answer woman. You've got the prayers that inspire people around you and intimidate people around you, and you've got this faith that is just rise up and lead them to victory, but if you don't have love, it's nothing. It's no good because you're not doing anybody any good. And he says, look, Christians, if you are content in making a point, but never making a difference, don't think for a second that your Heavenly Father is impressed with what you're doing. You're not a good Jesus follower if you're content with making a point and not making a difference. It says no matter where you go or what you do or what you have or what abilities you have or what you can say or speak or whatever you've got, if there's not a part of you that is willing to wade into the messiness of other people to help them, you're nothing. You're no good to anybody because it's about you. Your gifts are about you until you start using them with agape love for the people around you. And so, we start a new year. We start 2016 and we're trying to self-improve, and that's good. That's great. And maybe some of those resolutions we're making are about our relationship with God, and that's also good. We say, okay, you know what? I'm going to spend time with God. I'm going to do this. I'm going to have worship times and quiet times. And you get up early in the morning to do it, and you've done it consistently, and 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days in a row, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks in a row. We're going, yeah, I'm doing it. And we're thinking God's going, yes, he's doing it. Look at him. He woke up 15 minutes early, 3 weeks in a row to spend time with me. Yes, look at that guy. And Paul's saying, look, hey, don't stop doing that. That is good. That is great. Relationship with God is the core of this thing we call Christianity, but it is not the end, so don't fool yourself into thinking that's enough for devotion to God. We go, man, this is a little heavy-handed, Paul. But here's his point. Devotion to God does not stop with your moral perfection. Your devotion to God does not stop with your sinlessness. Your devotion to God does not stop with, okay, my conscience is clear now, so I'm good. It doesn't stop with, okay, I made it through the day, and I haven't messed up, and I haven't sinned, and I'm good. I didn't drink. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. And look what I did do. I did do this and this and this, and I did. God, look at these things that I did and didn't do to make myself a better Christian. And Paul says, that is good. That is, do all that stuff. That's great. That's the introduction. That is the setup for a life of agape-focused, servant-hearted love. Because if all you're doing is making a better you, and it goes no further than you're no good to God, and you're no good to anybody else. You are, according to the Apostle Paul, nothing. Nothing. And again, that's kind of hard. It's a little tough. And Paul's being honest here, but this is from a guy who knows what he's talking about. If anybody can say it, aside from Jesus, it's probably Paul. Here's a guy who took a faith in Jesus Christ, a strong conviction, a strong belief, and turned that into literally world-changing action. Furthermore, here's a guy who got allowed to write about half of the New Testament. So I think if we're going to take anyone's opinion as fact, it should probably be Paul's at this point. And he's saying, look, you need to put action in your devotion. Put your devotion into motion, because if your devotion's not resulting in action, it's not what you think it is. It's not what you think it is, because devotion to God is authenticated not just by your love of God, but by your love for others as well. It's not just a vertical me and God thing, it's a horizontal thing too. me and everyone else. That is so important. It's so good. And we talk about so much the importance of relationship with God and your intimacy with God and your devotion to God. And that is so important. But the moment that is it for us and it stops there, we miss the other half of the equation. What's the greatest commandment, guys? Love the Lord your God. What's number 2? You love the people around you. And somehow we like to forget that last part. Me and God, and I'm good. There's a reason that Jesus bothered to mention that second part, because it's right there in terms of importance. And if you're not a Christian, if you're listening to this morning, and you're going, yeah, that's exactly why I'm bothered by the church and bothered by Christians and bothered by all these religious people. And right here's where we owe you guys an apology. Because from a young age in Christianity, we're taught that Christianity is about our sin. And it's about our sin and God and getting rid of our sin and getting forgiveness from God and stopping sin in your life. And, God, please forgive me. I messed up. And God, please help me to not do it again. And God, please help me and I and me and I and me and I. And God's going, good, great. Okay, we're good. But all we talk about is you. All we talk about is me and you. Why can't we get you outside of your own head for a second and considering the rest of my children? We're supposed to be the hands and feet, okay? We can't do that if all we're concerned about is us and our self-improvement. That is important. It is crucial. It is very good. But it's not the end. It's not the end. And when our faith, when our personal devotion goes no further than, God, how am I doing? When our personal devotion, when our faith stops at our personal attempts to become better people, to become more godlike. Our message to the world, when it stops there, is this. We know it all, and we're better than you guys. We know it all, we're better than you guys. You guys shouldn't be doing that. You guys really need to stop that. We're better than that. We don't do that. We don't drink that. We don't eat that. We don't put that into our bodies. We don't hang out with those people. We don't do that kind of stuff. And you know what? You can come hang out with us too, and you can be better than everybody else too, as long as you fix that stuff in your life first, and then you can maybe come hang out with us. And so you come on, it'll be fun, I promise. Come be a drag, just like us. And the thing about Jesus Christ, you look at Jesus, and if there's anything that should be irresistible, it should be Jesus and his message. That's something that speaks to the heart of the human condition. Jesus is irresistible in my eyes, and if there's anything that the world is resisting about Jesus, I think it's probably not Jesus. It's probably us. It's probably his church. Because who is going to resist the kind of grace that Jesus showed in his life? Who is going to resist forgiveness? Who is going to resist hey, you know what? Let's start where you're at and let's take a baby step. Who's going to resist that? Who's going to despise that? And yet, we get confused and we say, okay, my devotion to God is measured by my personal well-being and spiritual maturity, and that's where it's at. And then all the rest of the stuff is kind of a bonus, but it's really about, it's me and God first. Am I getting my life together? Am I getting better? Am I getting more mature? Am I getting the sin rid of my I? And when it ends right there, our message to the world is, we know it all. We're getting it together. Look at me. I'm fixing myself. I'm getting rid of my sin, and you guys still have all this sin. So, you know what? You can come join us, and you can come be better than everyone else and know everything too, but not yet, because you got to fix your stuff before you can come hang out with me, because I've been working on my stuff lately. And so no wonder people feel like they're not good enough to come to church. I've got a good friend, and he hadn't been going to church for a long time, and I met with him and I talked with him, and I said, where are you at? Have you dropped your faith in God, and you don't believe in this stuff anymore? And he said, no. He said, you know what? I believe in God, I believe in Jesus, but I don't feel like I can go to church. I don't feel like I can call myself a Christian because I'm not consistent enough to match up with people who go to church and with other Christians. I'm not consistent enough. Because the message that he had been given by the people around him, the churchgoers around him, is you can come join us when you get your stuff together. As if all Christians have their stuff together. Raise your hand if you've got all your stuff together. I'm really glad you didn't raise your hand because I was going to call you out. Who is going to be attracted to that? We've got everything together. Come join us and be everything, have everything together too. So you can be above and high and mighty on your high horse with us. Who's going to be attracted to that? It was Gandhi who said, you know what, I like your Christ. I like that guy. I don't like your Christians. Because your Christians are so unlike your Christ. No wonder. No wonder the world resists us. And this is why Paul says, yes, this is good. It's important. It is so crucial to have this connection with God and this devotion to God and the personal stuff. It's just not enough. It's not the end. Because if you're not loving outside of yourself, if you're not loving outside of your comfort zone, you're nothing. No good. So let's think about it this way. When you think about God, when you think about the reason you follow God, what is the thing you're most grateful for? Just think about it for a second. You don't have to answer. What's the thing you're most grateful for? There's a lot of things that could be thrown out there, okay? So a lot of stuff that could be thrown out there, but it's all going to boil down to the fact that God so loved the world, so loved us, so loved you, that he came down and intervened and sacrificed himself for us, for our sake. That's usually what it's going to boil down to, because that's what we sing about, okay? That's what we worship about. That's why we have these crosses all over the place. That's what brings tears to our eyes. When I survey the wondrous cross. You know what is not the thing that we're most grateful to about God? The fact that he is perfect sinlessness. That's a cool thing. That's an inspiring thing. The fact that Jesus never messed up, that he never goofed, he never sinned, that's a cool thing. It's inspiring to me. But what stirs us up, what moves us, is not the fact that Jesus, that God was perfect and that never goofed up. What stirs us up is when we hear that it was that perfect God who sent his perfect Son into our mess for our benefit, because that's the gospel. That is the good news. And that's what brings tears to our eyes, is when we think about our sinfulness and how we messed up and how we ruined our lives and how we were lost and without a way out. And God came down himself, sacrificing, and gave us a way out, a way to redeem our lives by Jesus' death on the cross. In other words, it is God's action, it's his doing, it's his intervention that inspires us and that lifts us up and that breaks down our resistance. And here's why that's important. If you're a Jesus follower, and if I'm a Jesus follower, then we have to follow Jesus into action for the world around us. Because if being personally put together was enough, if being free from sin and free from all the goof-ups and the mess-ups, and you were put together was enough, Jesus would have stayed in heaven, and he would have looked down at us and gone, wow, somebody needs to do something about that. Change the channel. But what we celebrate in Christianity is the good news, because there's really good news in the gospel. At the center of the gospel is the fact that God did not just believe something. He didn't just believe something, but that he did something. It's the great action in history. He did not just believe, he did. And your devotion to God and my devotion to God is incomplete until we put our devotion into action, until we put our devotion into motion, because our devotion to God is authenticated not just by our love for God, but also by our love for others as well. And there's something, there's something in all religious people, and this goes back to ancient times, but there's something in all religious people that wants to keep it vertical, okay? That wants to keep it between me and God, because it's just between me and God, then I can kind of control it. And I just have to come up with a system that puts me in God's good graces, and then I'm good. And then Jesus comes along, he says, you want to be my follower? Well, it's a new day, because your devotion to your God is not just measured between you and God anymore. It's not just a vertical thing, it's a horizontal thing now. Your devotion to God is measured not just by your love for God alone, but by your love for his children too. And this is what he said. It's hard to get around this one. As you do to them, you have done unto me. Whew. How easily we forget that. You think God's impressed by the fact, oh, I love God, but I could care less about the people around me. As you do unto them, you have done unto me. That's really hard to get around. Now imagine for a second that had been the posture of the church the last 2 millennia. Imagine if that had been the posture of the church. Imagine if the only thing that the world resisted about Jesus Christ, about the church, was the fact that we believed that Jesus was the Son of God. Because I'm telling you, nobody's ever resisted the church because we were too loving. Nobody's ever resisted the church because we're too welcoming or too willing to carry others' burdens or too gracious or too kind or too whatever. People find it easy to resist us, to resist Christians, to resist the church because we know it all and we're better than everyone else. Or we act that way when we're not. And Paul says if that is your Christianity, if that is your approach to following Jesus, nothing. You're nothing, because it doesn't do anyone good but you. So as we wrap this up here, and the band can come up, but I don't want to be that kind of Christian. I don't want to be that kind of Christ follower, and I don't think you want to either. And we don't want to be that kind of church. We don't want to be that kind of church. So that means we have to step outside of what's comfortable for us. And that is going to bring us back to this big question, what breaks your heart? What breaks your heart? And are you going to be willing to put your devotion into action? And you don't have to quit your job, but you're probably going to have to quit something. You don't have to leave the country, but you're probably going to have to leave your comfort zone. You're not going to have to give away everything you have, but you're probably going to have to give more than you're giving now. But that's what we said in week 11. I hope that at the very least, this is going to hang in our heads until it stirs us to action of some sort. Because we said this in week 1, but we have no idea what hangs in the balance of our decision to embrace the burden that God has put on our hearts. And the only way to discover what hangs in the balance is by responding, by no longer just being vertical, just me and God, but by spreading our love to the horizontal as well. By starting to actively love the people who are in the situation around us that break our heart. Because Jesus put this in unmistakable terms, okay? It is doing, not believing, that makes the difference. It's doing, not believing, that changes the world. So what breaks your heart? And are you willing to do something about it? Let's pray. Father, thank you that you have put burdens on our hearts. Thank you that you've given us the opportunity to be your hands and feet and the potential to change the world around us. God, I pray that you would take this stuff we've been talking about the last 3 weeks and you would put it on our heads, put it on our hearts until it stirs us out of our comfort zones and into action. Father, I pray that you would just keep stirring us up as individuals, as families, and as a body of Christ right here, until we could be a group that makes a difference in the world around us instead of just making points. We love you, Father.